About 10 minutes ago, there was about 3 people here, so I'm really pleased that more have come in. As I say, it's a hard call, really, because the weather is fantastic. So, yeah, I'll try and make this worth your while. I'll make it as entertaining and as interesting as possible. So, the main thing is to talk about the book, but I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my other role as chair of the Scottish Society for the History of Photography, which I've been doing for about 6 years. We've moved heavily into publishing in the last few years, especially books. We're well known for our journal. I'm sure hopefully you're all members of the Society or studies in photography. Kat's here, she'll happy to sign anybody up. Membership is £40 per year, and for that you get 2 copies of this wonderful journal. So we produce this, but we're also, moving rapidly into book production. My book is the first book in the Scottish Photographic Artist series. Then we work very closely with Edinburgh University Press, and Carol, you can wave Carol if you like, is here from Edinburgh University Press. And one of the challenges, I don't think anybody's got involved in book production, but they're wonderful things to design, they're wonderful things to get involved in, but then you have to think about how do you sell them? How do you get them into the bookshops? And we really wrestled with that requirement. Do you set up your own sales team? It's very complex. So we're really grateful to have this partnership with Edinburgh University Press, who take care of our sort of marketing and sales requirements. In terms of photography, I think it's a really exciting time, actually. Photography is an incredible broad church. We all come at it from different sort of angles, and I'll cover how I came at it as really somebody trained as a painter. But as I say, it is an incredibly dynamic time, and even the most recent things are happening with AI, and I'm sure you've all picked up on the controversial Sony thing with the photograph that won a major prize and all that stuff. You would think everybody has a way of getting into photography, and actually Scotland is potentially one of the best places. Now, for a whole range of reasons, I think we've really struggled to really promote the way in which we have engaged with photography. And that's one of the reasons why I got involved with the Society. I got involved with them about 30 years ago. So my commitment is fairly long term. But it always struck me that why is photography not more central to the art curriculum? It was never taught when I was at school, and even when I was at art school, you rarely heard about photography. So there seems to be a bit of a challenge, I think we still have, to really get across the message that photography is such an incredibly broad church, and it's a way in which everybody, young, old, people who just, use their phones, people who are really keen on darkroom techniques. It's a great way of just actually engaging with an art form. But as I say, for some reason, we struggled to really get that promotion really kicked off, especially in Scotland, where we had some of the most interesting people involved in early photography. And I'll talk about that in a little while. Now, we have produced a little booklet. This is the only thing that is free tonight. So there's some copies of that available on the table. The Society, now called Studies in Photography, has been going 40 years. And this gives a bit of a summary of all the things that we're involved in. As I mentioned, we do the journals. We've also brought out a sort of parallel publication called Leaves, and there's a copy of that sitting over there. And we do sometimes the occasional partnership project. We did a project with the Women's Library and the National Trust for Scotland called Ways of Seeing. And if any of you got a chance to go and look at the Glean exhibition that was at the City Arts Centre in Edinburgh, that was a really interesting sort of exhibition covering sort of early photography in terms of women's involvement in it. We've asked Jenny Brownrigg, who's the curator at Glasgow School of Art, to give us a talk. It will be in the autumn, and she'll cover some of these key photographers like Margaret Fay Shaw. So again, names like Margaret Fay Shaw, Margaret Watkins, a bit better known now, but again, there's not been, I don't think, that sort of promotion. Anyway, I don't want to go too much on about that. I want to be able to talk about the book and about where I fit into the whole story of photography. So let's bring up the first image. Now, I would say this individual, Sir John Herschel, is more important than all the other pioneers and founders of photography. Everyone talks about Fox Talbot and Daguerre, but Sir John Herschel is central to how the story of photography began. And this is a wonderful image of him. I think it's quite well known by Julia Margaret Cameron. Herschel introduced Julia Margaret Cameron to the photographic process, the calotype process developed by Fox Talbot. So she was delighted to be able to present this particular image, and it's the classic image of the so-called scientist, and he was an extraordinary scientist. I want to just cover some of the things which some of you may know, but some of you may not. That's on an image of one of the couple of pages in his notebook. But Herschel was really, his passion was light and the effect of light on surfaces. And it was Herschel that coined the word photography. It wasn't Fox Talbot, it was Herschel. Mm-hmm. So the use of the word photography goes back to Herschel. Now again, that should be part of, thinking, all right, if you're getting involved, that's a key thing to be aware of. He also was the first person to use these terms negative and positive, And it was Herschel that really solved a major problem, because people have always been interested in trying to capture imagery onto a surface. The challenge was, how do you fix that image? So people like Wedgwood in the sort of 18th century was experimenting with, again, early photography, but the difficulty was fixing the image. Yes, they could get an image onto a surface, but the only way they could look at it was in candlelight. And if they exposed it to light, that image would just disappear. So it was Herschel that developed the hypo, the fixer, which is still used, and that's what makes an image permanent. So that allowed this incredible shift to happen. And it was Herschel that developed the cyanotype process. And that's really where my engagement really begins, through the use of that process. Now, what was interesting about Herschel was that he didn't patent the process. Now, Fox Talbot, when he developed the calotype, he patented. So he was very much coming at photography from a commercial business approach. He saw it as an opportunity to say, right, this is something, if I patent it, then people are going to have to come to me for the patent, and then, in terms of, taking photographs, they're going to have to always sort of, work that way through the patent process. Luckily, and that's why the story in Scotland is extremely important, luckily, through the influence of Sir David Brewster, Fox Talbot agreed not to patent the process, the calotype process, in Scotland. And that's why Hill and Adamson were able to make all those extraordinary images over a 4-year period, because the process was not patented in Scotland, and it allowed for incredible experimentation. Didn't happen in England. In England, if you wanted to use the calotype process, you had to apply for the patent, and that discouraged a lot of experimentation and innovation. So that's why, in terms of the real developments of early photography, it all happened in Scotland. And again, when I was at school, nobody ever mentioned any of this, and even at art college, why Scotland was so central to the story of photography. But going back to the cyanotype process, he gave a paper in 1842, and he just put that in as a side within the paper, what the cyanotype process was. He didn't patent it, And that allowed then people to use the process, you know. And I'll talk mainly about Anna Atkins a little bit later on, why she used the cyanotype process as opposed to the calotype process, you know. Okay, so let's start my story within all of this. I would say I was born in 1950. So for the first 12 years of my life, I really was in a sort of state of you might say, sleep mode. Nothing much happened. But my parents, being Scottish, my father was very determined that we got back to Scotland. And typical Scottish parents, there was no discussion. You know, I was attending a normal school in England, normal state school, and we suddenly arrived in the north of Scotland. So it was like going from one environment to another environment, literally overnight. So we ended up, you couldn't get any further north, we ended up in Dunnet Head, where my father rented a farmhouse. So suddenly I went from Northampton, traditional boot and shoe environment, very industrial, to suddenly being immersed in this incredible world of the Caithness landscape. And it had a profound impact upon me. I attended the local school, but I found it extremely challenging as trying to make that transition from one world to the other. And I would say that up in Caithness, they weren't particularly that receptive or welcoming to people coming in. We were the first wave of incomers. I mean, the reason my father went up there was because of the Atomic Energy Authority. But we were, as I say, 1962, so we were part of that first wave. And I think it was quite a shock, especially also to people in Caithness, Thurso, Dunnet Head, this wave of people coming up. So my experience at school was pretty painful. So I tended, like a lot of kids who were going through quite a difficult time, because you don't share these things with your parents. As far as my parents were concerned, the minute I left the house, I was somebody else's responsibility. And they didn't want to know what was happening within the school environment, you know, but it was pretty tough. So I immersed myself really in nature, and that was the way in which I sort of somehow tried to sort of unravel everything that was happening to me. And especially going out to the local quarries, fossil hunting, because that became my passion, botany and fossil collecting. So geology and botany. And Caithness is incredibly rich in that type of, you know, situation, you know, in terms of the plants and in terms of the fossil fish. So for me it was a very sort of, an amazing time. And I'll make this connection between the fossil and how I began to think about this idea of working in a particular way with the cyanotype process. So ended up eventually at art school. Now you might think, well, how did you get to art school? Well, the only good thing I could do was I could draw. And normally after a while you gravitate into the art department, and I knew it was my way out. And I knew if I didn't get out of where we were living, that would be it. I knew I had to get to an art school. And I, lucky enough, got to Edinburgh College of Art. Well, I thought it was lucky at the time, because it was as far away as I could go from my hometown. So, quite a conservative world, Edinburgh College of Art. And very focused around the painting school. That's why I went into the painting school. And again, as I say, there was no discussion about photography at all, you know. So it didn't really exist. Which again, to me, looking back at it now, is rather extraordinary. But the one event that gave me a little bit of hope was an event that happened in 1970 called Strategy Get Arts, when a group of German artists took over the art school and they put on this amazing event. Now, one of the very first book that I arranged to get published was about Strategy Get Arts. So if you're really interested in knowing more about this incredible story, then that book is available through the Studies in Photography website. But strategic art was incredible in the sense of these amazing artists who were basically breaking all the rules. They were doing things which they weren't meant to be doing. And the reaction from the college was one of real hostility, a sense of saying, you know, what are these people doing here in our environment? But I found it completely fascinating, and it really helped to give me a bit of a boost that whatever I wanted to do, I was maybe on a certain pathway which was correct. Now, this idea of the correct pathway, one of the flats I had in Edinburgh was opposite the Botanical Gardens. And I spent, because of my interest in plants, I spent a lot of my 4 years at art school in the Botanical Gardens. And gradually, you get to know the different buildings and what they do. One place I spent a lot of time was the library. And one day, the librarian there said, you might be interested in looking at these images. And it was images by Anna Atkins of British algae, seaweed, around the coastline of Britain. I'll bring up a couple for you to see. And I thought, wow, these remind me very much of the fossils. And I don't know any of you been fossil collecting, but you know, you go into a quarry, you look around, you find a stone, you try and split it, and if you're lucky, when you open it up, you get this sort of incredible impression of something. Usually, if you're lucky, it's a complete fish. But the reality of it is thinking, well, this existed thousands and thousands of years ago, and now it's there, held. Somehow the actual fish has been transferred. And I found that quite a magical idea. So when I was looking at these images, I thought, oh, that's amazing. And that idea sort of stuck with me, thinking, well, that allows me a little bit to connect with what I want to try and say about the time and my engagement, you know, with the Caithness landscape. But I still wasn't too sure how I was going to go about it, but that was setting me off on a particular pathway. But as I mentioned, Herschel developed the cyanotype process. He didn't patent it. So when Anna Atkins in 1843 made this decision, her father worked at the British Museum. She was already incredibly skilled at drawing things like shells. She was involved in the natural history department there, and she had this idea of trying to record these seaweeds. And she thought, right, I've got a choice. I can either use the calotype process or the cyanotype process. We think that she chose the cyanotype because it was blue, and the idea of seeing blue, but maybe it was just by chance she thought, well, one is patented, the other one is completely free. And I'll go for the cyanotype process. Now that was a really lucky move on her part, primarily because the extraordinary thing about a cyanotype, it is incredibly permanent. It's possibly one of the most permanent of all the photographic processes, you know. Whereas when Fox Talbot started to really push the calotype, even 5, 6, 7 years later, as he was bringing out different volumes, different books, again, because she brought out the first book, that's now recognised, the first book in the world, first photographic book in the world, was hers on the cyanotype of these plants. But when Fox Talbot started to bring out his book, Pencil of Nature, a lot of the calotypes gradually began to fade or get distorted because they hadn't been properly fixed. Whereas the way of fixing a cyanotype, and I'm sure that you've done it, is just to bathe it in water. And that's why it's one of the most non-toxic, most straightforward ways of making an image. You know? So that was my introduction. All right, so I finish art school, and then I'm thinking, well, I want to really go back to Caithness, even though it was quite a painful, but it was the landscape of Caithness that I was responding to. And I decided what I wanted to do was spend time on an island off John Groat's Stroma, and there I wanted to make a plant survey. And I wanted to use the cyanotype process, like Anna Atkins had done, to really begin to record the plants on Stroma. Now that was the idea, but when I got there, a lot of other things obviously sort of happened. I don't know if anyone's lived on a deserted island, and just the reality of just survival, it becomes extremely challenging. Getting water getting firewood, getting your food, all the things that you don't figure out as you know. You're the sort of an artist thinking about your concept. You're not worrying about the practical. You know, you can't nip round to the local corner shop, but it was incredible. Spent 6 months there. And what I did was, I divided the island up into sections and just gradually began to map each of those sections, you know, and began to become part of the landscape. And that was really, for me, this idea of being fully immersed again in nature and using some sort of medium, art form, to sort of way of trying to record it. And these are my early cyanotypes from Stroma. So when I came back from Stroma, the challenge then, like for most artists, is, well, then what do you do with the work? And one of the biggest challenges I had was thinking about, well, do I take this work and try and sell it in a gallery, or try and figure out, well, what do I want to do with the work? Because one of the problems was thinking, well, even if I put the work in a gallery, very few people are going to really understand the journey that I took to make these images, and the work relates much more to a particular place. And that became, for me, quite a complex struggle, thinking about how you juggle the engagement with an art market and making a living, and being true and honest to the work that you're making. And especially at that time, I mean, things have changed a little bit. I mean, when I left art school, you know, you weren't thinking about that you could, you know, how are you going to make a living from all of this, you know? There wasn't really a sophisticated art market as there is now. But it was still this dilemma, this push and pull of how you work in a particular way, you know, and how you respect what you're trying to do. So, I knew I was on the right path, and I knew that this was a medium that I wanted to use, but I was still frustrated with the imagery that I was getting. And part of the frustration was that I really wanted to find a way in which I could work with a plant where I only made one image from that plant, and I only worked with something that is fresh, something that is, you know, you just take it straight out of the landscape and you make an image from it. Now, the challenge of that is that a plant is mainly moisture, and a cyanotype, when you fix a cyanotype, you're using water. So trying to work with fresh plants is very, very difficult. But somehow in my head, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to somehow have this relationship with the plant, with nature, and allow that relationship to be fairly equal, and try and respond in a way where I would make just one image from a particular plant. And that's what I gradually, over the next 10, 15 years, really began to work on. How do I perfect that process? How do I make that process work for me so that the plant is transferring like a trace of the plant onto the paper? So you're also getting the pigmentation, you're getting part of the pollen, you know, you're getting really the essence of that plant. Because normally when you're working with a cyanotype, you'll just use a negative, you know. And even when Anna Atkins was doing the seaweeds, she would dry the seaweeds. Because if you use wet seaweeds, it would just end up being a bit of a soggy mess. So that I set myself quite a high bar, but that's what I wanted to do. And then slowly, over a period of time, I eventually figured out how I can make the images that I wanted to make using that particular way of sort of working. You know, and that's the sort of images that are very much sort of captured sort of in the book, you know. The next thing was, okay, well, why would you do it? What is the purpose of making a cyanotype? Because I thought, okay, I can get what I want, this idea of the trace, but what I'm really interested in is some of the ideas behind what's happening, you know, in the natural world. And also this way in which working on ideas or concepts to do with, you know, how nature's being manipulated or being pushed or cultivated in a particular way. The first major project I worked on, which was the Peace Rose project in Pursuit of Perfection, was the idea of taking the idea of looking at roses and why somebody would breed roses in a particular way, this idea of cultivating a rose to make it a perfect rose. When you look at a rose in the wild rose, it's absolutely stunning, it's beautiful. So this obsession that people get with trying to control, manipulate, work with something and make it something which is now under the control, and I say it's very much a male pursuit, especially rose breeding. And that became for me an approach I wanted to take. So the cyanotype became more as a signifier of something. I had the idea that I wanted to work with in terms of the medium, but then I wanted to try and then apply that medium to some ideas to do with how plants are being sort of managed or manipulated or controlled, And that's been the work that I've been working on for the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years. Looking at issues to do with sort of plant pollution, how pollution affects plants, and I'll cover some of that. Plants in terms of climate change, in terms of phenology, how again looking at plants as indicators. So these are all things which I've just used this cyanotype process for. This was an exhibition I had at the Fruitmarket Gallery, looking at again plants as bioindicators, and this was back in the late 90s. And it was at a time when there was a big debate about diesel cars and diesel buses and about the push towards diesel. Without people realizing the pollution from diesel was having a major effect on people's health, And even though there was a lot of indications that people were dying, it was never put down as airborne pollution, And I found that, again, a very interesting thing I wanted to really get into. And I worked with a university in Stuttgart who were working on a big European project, saying you could have not very expensive, lots of scientific equipment in cities, but if you put plants in particular areas in cities, you can look at their leaves, and if the leaves are beginning to degrade, it's because of pollution. And if that's happening to leaves, that's exactly what is happening to human health. And now, 20 years on, that's all known. Everybody now knows about the effects. And in fact, even a recent study that came out just a couple of weeks ago saying it affects everything about human health, airborne pollution, But there's been very little done about it. So that was an exhibition I put on, I tried to get publicity, but again, wasn't much traction around it. But this was a project working with Edinburgh University, the Department of Geology, and working with some of their equipment. And we were looking at petals in Princess Street Gardens. And again, the idea of Princess Street Gardens is a beautiful place you go to relax. You're walking up and down, you're smelling the flowers, without realizing sitting on the flowers is all these airborne particles, mainly from diesel, Another project where I took an idea to do with, this was a commission. So again, using the process, but saying, okay, I can take on now some public art projects. And this was a commission for the Dundee Science Centre. And they wanted a sculpture that would connect the Science Centre with the newly opened Dundee Contemporary Art Centre. And I was commissioned, and I wanted to work on this idea of a very common plant, the Rosebay Willowherb. And again, something which again I think you all experience at times when you get these incredible clouds of sort of seeds that are just flying everywhere. And again, I find that a fascinating idea. This idea of a seed on a journey, where it goes to, where it lands, how it then life is created from it. So playing around with that idea, and this was the result that was put up in Dundee, which is a 9-metre high glass prism with cyanotype imagery on the inside. If you've been to Dundee, you might have seen it, but it's in a rather sad state at the moment, just because it's not been adopted by the City Council. When it was commissioned by Tayside Enterprise. and they didn't write out an agreement with Dundee City Council. So there was a battle that's been going on for the last 15 years about who's responsible for this particular sculpture. And meanwhile, the sculpture just looks worse and worse. Anyway, hopefully one of the things I'll try and do is try and have a chat with Dundee about it and see if they can help out. This was a project I did with the Royal Botanic Gardens. So again, I kept on going back to the Royal Botanic Gardens, and one of the things which they've been working on for the last 100 years is phenology. Phenology is where you look at how plants are good indicators of what's happening to the climate. So when does something first come into leaf, things first come into bud. So this was a project I started working on with the Royal Botanic Garden, and I wanted to do a project with another research centre, and I made a connection to one in Poland, in Poznan, where they've done a 40-year study on the dog violet. And again, they were tracking how quickly the changes are coming through in terms of when the dog violet comes into flower. So it's a cyanotype, which is what I make, but behind it is the story, the ideas, what I'm trying to convey. But I mean, that's, people can just enjoy the cyanotype if they want to, but that's what I work on mainly, is this partnership often with scientists, and try and think through how the ideas within my photography can then try and promote a slightly wider debate about, is this a call to social action, which we now know with climate change. There's more and more people engaged with the issues of climate change, and this was just maybe a small way in which I can make a contribution to that. This is the two scientists on the left from the institute in Poznan, Caithness, where the dog violets are, and that at the same time I put on an exhibition of work in a gallery in Poznan. So often we'll try and set up collaborations between a curator or a gallery owner in the city. So there's again a lot more discussion and ideas about how we can keep these things going forward. And then following on from that, this is one of my favourite small galleries in Warsaw, Vauxhall Gallery. And by this stage I had quite a body of work, and it was an opportunity to put a lot of the work on display. And again try and initiate again through talks and events a little bit about what the work was all about. This was possibly the longest, 6 months I spent on Stroma, but I took up a Leverhulme fellowship a number of years ago to spend a year working in Brantwood, which was the home of John Ruskin. And Ruskin, deeply unpopular for a whole range of reasons, but an incredible individual in terms of his ideas and what he was concerned about. And he was one of the very first people to talk about pollution. Wrote numerous essays about the effects, especially from the Victorian industrial situation in terms of chimneys and where the pollution was going to. But equally, he had to make a decision where he was going to spend the remainder of his life, and he ended up buying this estate near Coniston. And he developed a moorland garden there where he was experimenting with different forms of crops that he wanted to try and grow at certain altitudes. So I spent a year living in the house, Ruskin's house, in Brantwood, and then mapping again around the moorland garden and making again close observations about the plants, and trying to sort of be like a plant, much more rooted, because again that's one of the differences between us and plants. I mean, we can move around, whereas plants can't. So for me, I made this commitment that, or I wouldn't travel and go great distances. I would just spend all the 1 year in a fairly small area and just watch the changes that happened over that period of time. And then this is some of the work that comes out of it. So this work was shown obviously in Brantwood in the house. It was shown at Lancaster University, and then when they opened up the John Hope Centre in Edinburgh, they asked me to show the work there as their first exhibition in the new John Hope Centre. And it was again to cement this partnership that I have with the Botanic Gardens and the scientific teams that work there. And then we come to where I am at the moment. So I haven't stopped working, even though I'm quite busy with studies in photography. I 3-4 years ago bought a 5-acre plot woodland plot, with really ancient woodland with oak trees and sweet chestnut trees at the foot of the Lammermuir Hills. And as you do, eventually got a hut built. And this is now going to be my base for the next, I don't know, how many years I've got left. Starting to really explore within that 5-acre area, you know, some just very personal things about, you know, plants and what I want to try and sort of finish my sort of career off with in terms of cyanotypes. So I've been doing it for 50 years. I might hope to get 60 years out of the cyanotype process. And then we'll see what happens next. So,